everybody. Thank you so much for taking the time to join me today. And today we're going to talk about how to recover from a disaster at scale. My name is Melissa Palmer. I'm a senior technologist in the product strategy group at Veeam, and I'm also a VMware certified design expert. So we're going to have a very heavy VMware slant on what we talk about today. Now, a little bit more about me. I've actually been doing disaster recovery in some way, shape, or form throughout my whole career. Before I came to Veeam in my previous life as a VMware administrator, I worked with an environment with over 1,000 VMware hosts and 25,000 VMs. So I know a couple things about what we need to do to make sure that we can recover everything at scale. You know, if we're talking about disaster recovery for a single application or a single group of servers, things are usually pretty simple. But as we talk about recovering a whole environment in that type of scenario, things can get a little more complicated. So we're going to make sure we walk through all of that today and how to make it as simple as possible. You know, disaster recovery seems to get a bad name sometimes, but it really is an essential function. And if you don't believe me, I want to start with a couple of statistics to help us kind of set the stage. Now, Veeam has something called the Data Protection Trends Report, which is a huge independent research survey. And we find that a lot of organizations have something called a reality gap. Now, what's a reality gap? It's how people think they can recover versus their actual recovery capabilities, right? So we find that a lot of organizations think that they're backing up their data appropriately or they can recover their applications and they're good to go, but they actually can't, right? We're finding a huge gap between this. And I think some of the reasons, honestly, are lack of planning and testing for disaster recovery, which are two of the huge things that we're going to talk about today. Now, let's talk outages. Over the past 2 years, what are the most common outages that organizations have experienced? And you can see number one is a cybersecurity event. I'm talking about ransomware specifically because every time we look in the news, we're seeing ransomware. But again, there's a lot of those more classic type disasters that also have a huge impact, you know, accidental deletion of data, some kind of infrastructure outage, application outages, hardware outages, all the things we think of when we think about traditional disaster recovery. But that cybersecurity event has come into everybody's view very, very rapidly over the last couple of years. And from this, we can actually make a really sweeping generalization that I think will help everybody with their disaster recovery planning. And that's that ransomware is a disaster. You know, when we think disasters, we think fire, floods, outages, but ransomware is absolutely a disaster. And the best thing you can have in place during a ransomware attack is a fully tested and validated disaster recovery plan. You know, a lot of organizations might not have DR plans because they've calculated the risk of, you know, a natural disaster in the area. And they've decided it's so low that it would just be cheaper to take the outage and deal with it later. Unfortunately, the probability of a ransomware attack these days is basically 1. It's going to happen. It's not if you get hit by ransomware, it's when. So the time is now to put things into place so we can recover later. And of course, if we're talking ransomware, that is a large scale recovery event. So we're going to go through some of the considerations that everybody needs to keep in mind when they're putting those plans into place and how to make sure their recovery is successful later on. I know a lot of organizations struggle with disaster recovery. This isn't something new. There's been struggles with DR since DR started, since data centers have come online, right? And that's a couple of reasons. And, you know, the advent of virtualization and how big environments have grown has played a huge role in this. IT environments are gigantic. It is just so easy to deploy a new VM these days. And that means they're constantly changing because we constantly have apps coming online and going offline, right? Change is pretty much a constant. Unfortunately, traditionally, recovery has been complex and often fails, especially if we talk about disaster recovery tests even. I remember early in my career, you know, going to the offsite co-location facility. I had my clipboard and the things I had to do to recover from disaster. But a lot of RDR tests were just getting enough of an application online to say that it worked and we passed our disaster recovery test, right? It wasn't a real world accurate depiction of what would happen if we ever had to recover. And because some of these processes are so manual and maybe not tested as thoroughly as they should be, this means that recovery is often complex and fails. And of course, disaster recovery planning. It takes time and resources. It takes time to create those disaster recovery plans, and it takes resources to create those plans and test them. So these are some of the reasons that disaster recovery historically has been such a problem for organizations. And now I want to switch gears a little bit to talk about how we can fix some of that. Now, when I talk about disaster recovery at scale, recovering your whole environment after some sort of event, there's really three things we have to talk about. First is planning. We need to plan to be able to recover today so that if we have a disaster tomorrow, we will be able to recover. There's a lot of upfront work that has to happen before you can actually recover from disaster. Next is monitoring. And this is going to be interesting because it might not be the monitoring that you're thinking of, but we need to keep an eye on our environments throughout their life cycle to make sure that things are going to work as expected when we need to go to recover, as well as a couple other things. And then finally, recovery, right? What happens when disaster strikes? What do we have to do? And how do we ensure that we're going to be able to recover? So we're going to kind of break everything down into these three phases and give you some tips for how to get there, how to get that confidence that when disaster strikes, you're going to be able to recover. So let's talk about disaster recovery planning. And really, the most important step here is protecting your assets before disaster strikes. Let's just take the example of backing up a virtual machine. If you've never backed up that virtual machine before and it is encrypted by ransomware, you will not be able to recover it because you never protected it. So the most important step when it comes to disaster recovery is protecting those assets before disaster. Now, there's different ways to protect your assets based on their criticality, which ties into some of the key steps in disaster recovery planning. If I kind of just sit and do a brain dump of everything that needs to be done to be able to recover from disaster, this is kind of what the flowchart looks like. The first thing is to perform a business impact analysis. We need to work cross-functionally in our organizations with our application owners, with our executives, with our business owners, and with our technology teams to determine, okay, how critical is this application? And how does this translate into recovery point objective, RPO, which is basically what point in time are you recovering to after disaster, and recovery time objective, or RTO, which is just how long does it take you to recover, right? We need to figure out those values for each and every application, and that is usually a business decision. If you look at most critical applications in environment, they're usually the applications that make the most money that the organization needs to be able to run. Or if we're talking about things like the healthcare industry, right? Those are the applications that need to be online in order to care for humans, right? So the most impactful applications will have the lowest RPOs and RTOs. So we need to do that for everything in our environment. And I know that's a huge task if you've never done it before. But I will say, if business impact analysis seems so overwhelming, right? Start with your most critical apps, get those down, decide what you need to run your business at a bare minimum, and then put in a base level of protection for everything else. So again, at least those assets are protected and we know we can recover them in the event of a disaster like a ransomware attack. This ties directly to asset inventory and application dependency mapping. We need to have an inventory of all our assets that we're going to need to recover, and we need to know how they interact with each other. For example, things like Active Directory, right? We're probably going to recover that first because Active Directory is a predicator for everything else to run in our environment, right? Application XYZ needs Active Directory to come online, so we need to recover that. But we need to also know what applications might have shared components. If we're talking about a highly available SQL environment, for example, we might have a SQL Server with a number of databases on it, right? We need to know what databases are on that SQL server, and how it ties back to applications. So again, understand the business impact, those recovery point objectives and recovery time objectives, and then make sure that you know what asset is mapped to what application and how they interact with each other. I might have a database server, let's go back to our SQL example, where it has all tier 2 and 3 applications. They're not that important. They don't need to come online quite yet, but it has one database for a tier 1 application, which means that I need that whole server to come back before I can recover that tier 1 application. So those are things to think about. The next, of course, is data protection. And based on the outputs from things like business impact analysis, we'll decide how we need to protect our data to recover it. A couple of examples pop right in my head. Veeam's continuous data protection CDP is for those near zero RPOs and RTOs, right? It's a continuous replication, very, very ultra low near zero RPO and RTO. So mission critical applications, that's a good way to protect the data. Then we've got regular Veeam replication, and that might be more of a 15-minute RPO. But again, that RTO is going to be really, really small because we're using replication technology, right? All the data is already in our disaster recovery site. The amount of time it takes to come online is the amount of time it takes to boot the server, right? Also, we've got backups, Veeam backups, right? Maybe we're backing up every 12 or 24 hours. And maybe we're using storage replication as well. And we're sending that storage replicated volume every half an hour or so. It really depends, again, on the information from that business impact analysis, so you can make the right decisions on how to protect your data so you can meet those RTOs and RPOs. After we've done all of that, right, we need to create our disaster recovery plan. We need to know what we're going to do if disaster strikes. So we need to say, okay, application XYZ has these 50 servers in it. We need to recover them in this order, and this is the step that needs to be taken on each server. So that can be very, very time intensive and resource intensive. But when we're talking about the context of our VMware-based environments, we can actually use Veeam Disaster Recovery Orchestrator to automatically create that DR documentation and keep it up to date. It's got a great plan change log in the plan definition report, which will just say, okay, someone logged in, made some changes, we've captured them, we remain in compliance, because we can prove at a moment's notice we're ready to recover because we have an up-to-date DR plan, which ties into the second most intensive thing when it comes to disaster recovery, which is full-scale disaster recovery testing. And I'm not talking about testing 1 or 2 servers or 1 or 2 applications. I'm talking about a full simulation of I need to recover every application in my environment. Now that sounds very, very time and resource intensive and probably a little scary. But with Veeam Disaster Recovery Orchestrator, we can also use Veeam Data Labs technology to automate that for us. We can run disaster recovery tests scheduled or on demand, and we can even chain our plans together to test in a certain order. And this is really, really important, right? So let's say I have a tier 1 application that is gigantic. It's our most mission critical business application. Through this full scale testing, I might find that due to my VMware environment in my disaster recovery site, I need to recover this whole application soup to nuts before I recover anything else. Because if I try to recover 2 or 3 applications at once, everything slows down too much and I can't meet my RTOs, right? Maybe I have slow storage someplace and those backup restores just aren't happening quick enough. There's a number of ways we can fix that once we know the issues exists. We can use Veeam replication technology to make sure that the VMs are in the destination and just need to start. If we're talking backups, we can use Veeam's instant recovery technology so that it's just we're starting the VMs off of the backup repository. So once we have a really accurate picture of what that full-scale disaster recovery test looks like, and chances are it's going to fail the first time, we can then take the time now to go back and make improvements and changes to our infrastructure so that we know we can come back next week or tomorrow, or once we've made whatever changes, got new hardware, whatever we need to do, and we can test it again, and we can test it again, and we can test it again under multiple scenarios using different orders of application recovery until we can prove that we can meet our RPO and RTO at any time. And that's part of where that RPO and RTO verification comes in through, right? Testing. A full-scale disaster recovery test will verify that you can actually recover that application in the time that meets your objectives. Veeam has reporting technologies that'll email you a report that says, yes, we met our RTO. And we also will check that we met your RPO during that test. But we're also going to constantly be checking your environment to make sure that you're meeting your RPO, and that if something's wrong, we're going to figure it out. And that's going to come into play a little bit more when we start talking about monitoring. Now, last but not least, we have our applications identified. We know our RPOs and RTOs. We're protecting our data correctly. We have a DR plan. We've tested everything. Now we have to assess our recovery options. And that can also be something that is a bit overwhelming. But the truth is that every disaster is different, especially when we're talking about cyber events, right? So a ransomware attack, we might plan to recover to our DR data center and it might be okay, but maybe the hacker's gotten there too, and law enforcement is going to tell us, guess what, you can't actually use that DR site. It's really dependent on how close your data centers are, what kind of disaster it is. But today, with the rise of ransomware, it's no longer good enough to just have one plan in place, right? Just that one place I'm going to recover, because what happens if I can't actually recover there? And that is happening more often than not. So the other thing we need to do, once we have that DR plan nailed down, we know exactly what we need to accomplish, is we need to assess our recovery options. So where are we going to recover and what are our options, right? We have the traditional DR site, we have service providers, we have co-locations, we have VMware Cloud Solutions, which are personally one of my favorites because of the rise of VMware ransomware. If you're not aware, ransomware actors are actually targeting the vSphere infrastructure itself. They're going after your hosts to encrypt each and every VM. If they can get access to one VMware host in a cluster, they have owned your whole cluster and you're done. You can't recover in place and you can't recover that environment until you've rebuilt it. So what does that look like? Unfortunately, a lot of people are not in a place where they can rapidly rebuild their VMware environments right now, and that's something to look at as well. You want to be able to redeploy VMware in an automated fashion as quickly as possible, but that might not align with your RPOs and RTOs. You might need another option to get you online faster for those mission critical apps. And that's one of the reasons I love the VMware Cloud Solutions so much, right? It's a really easy way to start consuming the cloud. It looks and feels like regular vSphere to your operation teams. And what the strategy is there, you can actually just take a couple of nodes in your VMware Cloud solution of choice, have them running, have your critical services replicated there, have your backups in that cloud. And should you need to recover, there's many different ways you can start recovering in VMware Cloud. Once you have that initial cluster built, scaling all of the VMware Cloud solutions can happen within an hour. So we're talking really aggressive timelines to start being able to recover offsite. You can achieve the same type of thing with a service provider as well. You might have a co-location facility you work with, but the key is now is to start thinking about alternate recovery options once we have that DR plan now, because again, every disaster is different, especially ransomware. Now, after we've created our disaster recovery plan, we've tested it, we know our recovery options, we're good to go, our work actually isn't done. Because now I want to talk about monitoring. And what do people think of when they think about monitoring? They think of, a monitoring system's going to look at my environment. It's going to tell me if something's wrong. And I want to know if that VM is using too many resources, right? We're going to look at that. But really, when it comes to disaster recovery, there's a couple things we want to focus on when it comes to monitoring. First is detecting issues with data protection, right? Because we need to make sure that our assets are protected to recover from ransomware. So we want to make sure all of our assets are protected with automated reporting, showing us that everything is running and everything is completed. And if something's wrong, if a job hasn't run or a job has failed, we need to be alerted so we can take action, because that is a data protection gap right there, right? If that VM is not backed up, we might not be able to meet our RPOs. Another wonderful thing about Veeam One, which can handle all of this all this protection for you, is that Veeam One can actually find your unprotected assets. So we install Veeam One, you connect up your Veeam environment, you connect up your VM environment, and Veeam One will go out there and find what VMs are not being backed up for you. So then you have the ability to protect those assets. You can even do that automatically with Veeam One and just have, a catch-all data protection job of 24 hours of RPO, just so everything's protected, right? So this is also really useful in that planning stage where we make sure that all of our assets are protected now so we can recover them later. We also want to be detecting signs of ransomware, right? We really want to be inside of our environment and know it well and always keep an eye on it. So Veeam One can do a couple things out of the box as well. It can take a look at possible ransomware activity on your VMs, right? Are they acting funny? Are they acting out of norm? That might be an indicator of something going on, like encryption or exfiltration. And we're going to look at your backup. So if your backup increment suddenly grows, that can be an indicator that there's been a lot of change in file size or files, right? And that could be an indicator of encryption. So that is something that's really important to be alerted of in your environment as well. And then again, we always want to be looking at things like network performance, because we want to make sure that our replication is going to work and as expected. We can build alarms based on whatever specific measures we would like. And again, find those unprotected virtual machines so we can protect them today before we can need to recover tomorrow. Be ready to recover. Monitoring our recovery resources is very important. I know there's this tendency to build a DR site and never touch it again because it's not production. It is production as soon as disaster strikes, right? So we want to monitor the health of those recovery resources. We want to see if there's any hardware issues or software issues or licensing issues, right? Maybe our vSphere license is expired. That would be very bad when we go to recover. And we also want to monitor capacity, right? We want to know, do I have enough capacity to recover? And we can also uncover some of this through our regular DR testing. If we run that full-scale DR test for the first time, we find out we just don't have enough CPU, memory, or storage, we'll know, right? But again, we want to keep an eye on that capacity, especially if we're using replication-based technologies to make sure that we're always in a good spot. And again, we want to monitor these resources during that regular DR testing to make sure that everything is running as expected when we have our full workload running at our disaster recovery site. Now I want to talk about recovery. And if we do things the right way, this can actually be the easy part. I want to share another statistic from the DPR 22 report, failover failback mechanism. So how are organizations handling failover and failback? And a staggering 25% of organizations, that's it, just 1/4, have orchestrated workflows that will reconnect the resources that are now running remotely, right? So only 25% of people are ready to recover from a disaster in an automated manner. That means for 75% of you watching this right now, you're going to do things manually when disaster strikes. You're going to have to do manual testing, manual documentation, manual recovery, and that is error prone, right? So again, the time is now to take the steps, put them into place, and automate as much as possible so that when we get to recovery day, recovery is the easy part, right? We want recovery to be easy. And that's really, really important to give you the confidence. And when we talk about a cyber event specifically, right, Veeam aligns to the NIST cybersecurity framework really well, right? We have something for every phase of the framework. I do a lot in recover and respond and protect personally, but we have a solution to help you be able to protect those workloads and recover them at a moment's notice. And one thing I want to talk about real quick with recovery as well is 91 ways to recover at Veeam. Every disaster is different. So right now, I spent the whole session talking about recovering your full site after a ransomware attack, but maybe you are in a more traditional disaster situation where you've lost a couple servers or a file share or something like that, right? There's a million different ways. Well, not a million. There's 91 different ways to recover your data with Veeam backup and replication. So it's a really flexible solution that will kind of mold itself to any type of recovery requirement that there is. Now, what did we talk about today when we talked about disaster recovery at scale? We talk about taking the proper time to plan your disaster recovery plan and data protection, right? We need to make sure that we're protecting that data right now so we can recover it later. We need to monitor not only our data protection and our vSphere environment, but our disaster recovery resources as well. And come recovery day, we want to make sure that we're recovering everything in an automated fashion. That ties back to planning and monitoring to make things easy. The last thing we want to be worried about on recovery day is stressing out about recovering all these different things. And besides disaster recovery at scale, there's 91 different ways to recover your data with Veeam. But the three key products that really work together to protect your virtual machines are, of course, Veeam Backup and Replication, which is the engine that will protect your data. This is where we're going to get our continuous data protection, our replication, our backups, and storage snapshots, right? This is the key thing to put into place and configure our data protection. Next, we're going to use Veeam One for monitoring, reporting, and analytics. We're going to take a look at that Veeam Backup and Replication environment, make sure that it's running correctly, and make sure that all our data protection jobs are finishing as expected. And when something is doing something it shouldn't be, when we notice something that we're not expecting, we're going to provide alerting and reporting so that you can take action based on what you've found, right? Make sure those VMs are protected or investigate something that might be indicative of an issue in the environment. And last but certainly not least, we have Veeam Disaster Recovery Orchestrator, which is the add-on to Veeam Backup and Replication for automated disaster recovery. We're going to automate your disaster recovery documentation. We're going to automate your disaster recovery testing. And most importantly, we're going to automate your disaster recovery on disaster day, should it strike, which I hope it doesn't. And we're going to be able to provide reporting on all of that as well to make sure that you're in compliance and you can prove at a moment's notice that you're able to meet those, even the most aggressive recovery point objectives and recovery time objectives. So these are really the three key Veeam products that work together to provide that total protection solution when it comes to ransomware and disaster recovery. Again, I just want to thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to join me on how to recover from a disaster at scale. I do have a couple of phenomenal resources for you. We have the Data Protection Trends Report, which I've mentioned several times through this presentation. You can see for yourself. We have the paper on the Veeam Hardened Repository, which is a really great backup repository to provide immutability that you can use commodity hardware for. And of course, we have 7 capabilities you need for rapid and reliable recovery, which I encourage you to download and take a look at as well. Once again, thank you so much for joining me today.